1 Corinthians 13. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship, that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Thanks God for your word to us.
First Corinthians chapter 13. And you've probably heard this chapter before. It's very poetic. You've probably heard it at a wedding. Definitely verses 4 to 6, and maybe the whole chapter, verses 1 to 13. And it's very poetic because the Apostle Paul is moved. He's feeling existentially what the central theme of Christianity is. And he brings it up now, not at the beginning of the letter, but he brings it up now because this is the rebuilding stage. This is the foundation. This is the glue that allows the Corinthians to rebuild. This is the deep theme of the gospel. This is sort of the underlying theme of the world and the underlying theme of our stories. And one of the characteristics, one of the key things about a wedding is you're looking at another couple getting married. You're seeing the bride and the groom saying their vows to each other, and that captures a little bit of what is happening in this chapter, that it's not self-centered, love is not selfish. And so you catch a little bit of that at the wedding because you're seeing someone else get married, even though mostly at weddings people are either thinking about getting married or their marriages and less about perhaps the couple getting married. But there is a glimpse of that at that moment in a wedding. And I've thinking about love and weddings and things like this. You know that I quote C.S. Lewis a lot, and he has his own interesting love story in the story of his life. And also he, interestingly, he's very philosophically, he wrote the Narnian stories, but he's also a great philosopher as well. And C.S. Lewis sort of became a Christian in stages, became a Christian philosophically, and then kind of understood the depth and the power of God's love. And it's also interesting thing about C.S. Lewis is he didn't just write children's books, and he didn't just write non-fiction, Christian non-fiction, but his academic work. A key part of his academic world was looking at the medieval world and looking at love poetry, royal love poetry in the medieval world. That was one of his specialties. And that's why I wanted to highlight it this morning as we think about love. And just one more sort of small illustration to help us think about love. You've probably seen those Disney films, and you might have noticed that the difference between older Disney films and, particularly for my kids, you might have noticed that the older Disney films are about a princess and a prince falling in love, and either the prince finds the princess or the pauper finds the princess. Some combination of that relationship. That falling in love relationship, that's the older Disney films. You might have noticed the newer Disney films, it's about discovering your own self. It's about the things you love. It's not necessarily about a relationship. Now, sometimes that can be a bit unhealthy, that older Disney focus on a particular type of relationship. But equally unhealthy can be a focus on yourself and not on other people, because this passage is going to be showing us that love is other-centric. It's not about your own self. And interestingly, love, whether you look at Disney or the work of C.S. Lewis or through history, even though we are now in a post-Christian culture, the ruins of Christianity, we live in the ruins of Christianity. We use the themes and the words of Christianity and the ideas of Christianity, even if we don't agree with it or like it. And love is one of these themes. This idea of love is still a feature of the ruins that our modern culture lives in. And so in this chapter, I want to show you, I don't just want you to be inspired and hopefully you'll have a little bit of that, but I want you to see that love is both not just inspirational, felt, sensed, but also it's theoretical, it needs a context, and it's also practical as well. So that's my goal in showing you this passage. And I have 3 headings to achieve that. The first one is love needs a story. Second heading is love is embodied and self-sacrificial. And the third heading is love is from the Father. So let's take a look at that first heading. Love needs a story. I could have said love needs a context, because the Apostle Paul is in verses 1 to 3 giving a context. But as I was thinking about this passage, and I was also kind of thinking ahead to our Genesis series, which is coming up next month, and I was thinking about that, in July. I felt like we were almost in June, but the last Sunday of May. But in July, we'll be starting a new series in Genesis, and that's all about the big story, God's big story, and how people are brought into God's big story. And so the Apostle Paul would know that, and that's sitting in his thinking. So you could say context, but I think it's even more accurate and it carries more weight and it makes more sense of the passage to say love doesn't just need a context, but love needs a story. And the pagan story, the pagan context is not going to provide it. So we live in Christian ruins, and the Corinthians lived in pagan ruins, whether they were Roman or Greek or some barbarian ruins. And in verse 1, you can see there the Apostle Paul saying, if I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. So that's a reference to pagan symbols of worship. Those instruments themselves can be used in any religious context, but it's a sort of a unique feature of that time, of those temples. And so the Apostle Paul is saying, well, if it's a pagan context, then love won't make sense in a pagan context, is what the Apostle Paul is saying. But then spiritual gifts, even if you belong to a church and have spiritual gifts, that won't be sufficient context for love. You need more than that. Verse 2, if I have the gifts of prophecy, wisdom and faith. So he names 3 of the spiritual gifts. And even if you have them, and the Corinthians loved spiritual gifts because they enjoyed being spiritually prosperous despite all their other difficulties at the same time. What a strange church. But it doesn't matter if you're spiritually prosperous. It doesn't matter what spiritual gifts you have. They by themselves aren't enough of a context, aren't enough of a story to make sense of love. And the Apostle Paul goes deeper and perhaps even more controversial in verse 3. He's saying generosity and martyrdom won't provide a context for love. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. There's been a bunch of billionaires have broken up recently. So Bill and Melinda Gates' marriage is broken up, and another billionaire, the Bezos marriage broke up recently. He's the owner of Amazon, which we all kind of, during the previous lockdown, when we were ordering stuff, became familiar with. And Mackenzie Bezos, or I think she's Mackenzie Scott now, they split the wealth, and then she promptly gave away most of the billions received in the settlement. Very generous, extraordinarily generous. And Jeff Bezos is buying a new $500 million yacht. And it doesn't matter though if Mackenzie gives her billions away. If she gives all she possesses to the poor, but doesn't have love, it's meaningless. See, generosity is not enough of a context. Being a generous person, even, it goes a little bit further, even giving up your life is not enough of a context for love. If I surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. And this brings us now to verses 4 to 6, which is where we see that love is embodied and self-sacrificial. And I think here the Apostle Paul has, remember from chapter 1, all the way back in chapter 1, he has the factions in mind. You see, the Corinthians were divided in factions, not necessarily on some religious background, although probably there were people ex-Romans and ex-Greeks, those religions, and not race. There would have been barbarians, and there would have been Romans and Greeks and Jews in the congregation, and not gender, and not even wealth. Although that sadly back in chapter 3 played a part. But as we saw back in chapter 1, it's about personality. They were based on, these factions were personality based around the personalities of the different leaders in the Corinthian congregation. And the Apostle Paul probably has that in mind as he's telling them about this central theme of love, and as he thinks about rebuilding the Corinthian congregation. And we see that love is embodied. Remember the body metaphor from last week? That Paul uses the imagery of a human body to show how spiritual gifts help us grow spiritually and show grace to one another. And love isn't out there. I mean, you want to be moved and inspired by love, but it's not an abstract thing. It's embodied. And that's why it's so great to have this chapter right after the chapter about bodies. And it's embodied in a very immersive sense. So I use the word immersive rather than say comprehensive or exhaustive, because immersive means, dropping down into a pool of water and the water covers you up completely. Love is complete like that. It's embodied. Love is psychological. It's not about envy, verse 4. Love is about not remembering wrongs, verse 5. Verse 6 is psychological or spiritual, where you seek the truth. Love is about seeking the truth. And love is also practical. Verse 4, it's kind and patient. Verse 5, it's not easily angered. Verse 7, it seeks to protect the vulnerable. And then it's deep. Love is it's embodied in a deep human sense. It's felt, it's thought about, it's lived out. That's why the Apostle Paul says love always perseveres in verse 7. Love is embodied. We put love into practice with our words and our actions and our thoughts and our feelings and our plans and what we say and what we do. And love is also self-sacrificial. Verse 5, love is not self-seeking. Remember how I started the sermon about the reference to a wedding and not thinking about yourself for a moment, but looking at the couple getting married. looking at the love for the bride and the groom for each other. And that's the other key part. It's not just embodied and lived out, but it's giving up. It's self-sacrificial. And that kind of helps us, by the way, just quick small tangent. That helps us make sense of that passage where Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you need to take up your cross. And it doesn't mean a sort of a flagellation where you kind of need to wear, prickly shirts and, shoes without socks and, skip meals even when you need them. It's not that sort of pain when Jesus says, take up your cross. He's referring to, because when Jesus died on the cross, that was a sacrifice for others. That's what Jesus means. Love is self-sacrificial. It means taking up your cross. It means, verse 5, not being self-seeking. And this embodiment and selflessness should shape our obedience, our response to God. This is why Jesus says in John 13:35, how will they know that you are my disciples? And you will know if you have love for one another. Which brings us now to the third heading. Love is from the Father. And I actually had a longer heading, and I'll read out the rest of the heading. Love is from the Father, reciprocated by the Son, and shared with us. But love is from the Father was easier to summarise and give at the beginning. But that's how it works. That's what it is. Love is from the Father, reciprocated by the Son, and then shared to us. And we see this beginning in verse 8, where we see that love is eternal. Verse 8, love never fails. It's an absolute. And there'll be a time when spiritual gifts are unnecessary, when, verse 8, prophecies will cease and tongues will be stilled and knowledge and wisdom will pass away, but love is eternal. When perfection comes, verse 10, the imperfect disappears. Now, these verses 8 to 13, and particularly verse 13, kind of provoke a question. This emphasis on love, does it make faith and hope unimportant? Verse 13, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Why is love the greatest? Does it mean the other two are less? What does the Apostle Paul mean here? And I think the answer begins back in verse 10. Love is greater because compared to the other two. So let's take a look at verse 10. The answer begins because it's love lasts all the way into the future. Can you see the reference to the future there? Verse 10, when perfection arrives, and then verse 12, now we see but a poor reflection, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I will know fully, even as I am fully known. That eternal dimension to love is the beginning of our answer to understanding why the Apostle Paul says it is the greatest of the three. Because when we get to that future, when the imperfect disappears, when we shall see face to face and be known, who shall we see? Who will know you? And who will you know? And that person is the Father. The Father will see you. You will know the Father, and the Father will know you. Because it is the Father, God the Father, who sends God the Son, his only begotten Son, whom he loves, and who responds in turn with love to the Father. And we're invited to share in that love. That's what the gospel is. It's an extension of that inner Trinitarian love to us. And that's why once we are seen by God and see God, once we know the Father and the Father knows us, there will be no more need for hope. There'll be no more need for faith, because that is our hope, to be known and know, to share in that love between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. By the way, just a quick tangent for those who are interested. This area, the thing that I'm talking about right now, is called the beatific vision. And Jonathan Edwards, a famous, who's the last of the Puritans and the first of the evangelicals during the 1700s, he talks about and delights in this beatific vision of love between the Father and the Son, and the way in which